All right, so welcome back. This is somehow the second to last week for class. So this will be the last week of tutorial stuff, and then next week will be show and tell. So if you haven't started a project, maybe take the weekend to sit down and think of something to work on. Again, these are pretty chill. You shouldn't feel like you are pressured to do anything if you are busy. I mean, I know how life is these days, and I'm very aware that right now, especially one with the holidays, and two, just like the pandemic maybe coming back again or like rearing its ugly head again. I think, a lot of us are probably feeling a little bit burnt out, so I can totally understand if people are not like super heads down working on projects. But I would say like probably play with something and, come to class, and even if it's in the middle of something, maybe just show what you're working on, or maybe like have some ideas about something you want to try, maybe when you get more free time. And I think you'll get good feedback from people. So I would definitely recommend at least doing that at the minimum. I did put together a sign up sheet. So let me just grab the link to this really quickly. All right, so I'll drop this in our chat for everybody. Oops. So I put together a really quick little sign up sheet so that everyone will have 6 to 7 minutes. There's only 15 spaces. I know we've got some folks who watch remotely. I know we've got other people who are maybe working alongside and not necessarily coming to every meeting. So if we need more spaces, I will gladly make them, and we'll probably just condense everybody down to like 6 minutes, and then we'll go from there. So, but please put your name on there. And again, if you want to be the first person, I don't know, I'll be super appreciative. And we'll just, if we get 10 people to sign up, then we'll just make sure we compress the slots to fit everyone in time. If we get more and more people, I'll just keep adding spots. And again, I think I mentioned this before, but if you do, if you're not a public speaker, or you just don't feel comfortable doing it over our chat, please just shoot me a video and I can just play the video. We can do that instead. I don't think I'm going to publish this particular video, so it'll probably be more just the 20 or so of us. So I think that way people can have a little bit. Oh, it's view only for you. Okay, let me just check on that. Yep. Cool. It should be edit access now. Thanks for that, Nauko. Yeah, so if you don't want to do live, just send me a video and I'll play it, and that's totally fine. As I mentioned, I won't be publishing this particular piece. It doesn't really need to be up on YouTube. So if you've got more privacy stuff or whatever issues you might have, just know it's just going to be shown for us. And then what I'll probably do is I'll make the video available for like the next couple weeks, just for our group. And then at some point, I'll probably post a note in our Slack channel that I'll be taking it down. With that in mind, also, the videos will probably be coming down in the next couple weeks as well. So if you want to go back and rewatch some of them or anything, please make sure you do it over the next couple weeks. I'll drop a note in our Slack channel when I actually decide to remove them. Basically, what'll happen in the next couple weeks will be like, I don't know, probably around like the first of the year. I'll just be going in and cleaning up that doc, removing links to things that are maybe more privacy stuff, or particularly those videos. I'll leave the list up just so if people want to go and find the videos again, they can. But we'll start there. And then probably again in January, I'll start publishing the videos, mostly just the tutorials. So again, the discussions won't go up. That's just for us in this class. But tutorials will go live for people on the YouTube to be able to access them, that sort of thing. So I should just say, if there was a moment where like you don't want to be shown on YouTube or whatever, like just shoot me a note and I can make sure that you're not shown in any of those videos. Sound good? Cool. So that's it for housekeeping. So let's talk a little bit what we're going to do today. So today we're going to mostly look at, as I mentioned this last week, we're going to look at how sort of machines, or particularly deep learning neural networks see. And that will sort of like lead into a project we're going to work with, which is called Neural Cellular Automata. I'll talk a little about what that means. So we'll look at some slides for maybe the first 20 minutes of class, and then we'll dive into our tutorial. And I think this will be sort of a nice maybe wrap up to a lot of the themes we've been talking about in this class, which is like, one, we're just going to make static images move, mostly textures today, but you're welcome to play with other ideas and see what happens. And we'll also talk a little bit about just sort of like Well, if we're making videos for how humans see, we should also because we're using machine learning, we should think about how computers see. So we'll cover those topics today. So first things first, let me drop in the slides for our chat. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Just get my chat window open over here. All right. So as we mentioned, as we talked a little bit about last week, some of the interesting parts of structuralism, or at least some things that people were thinking about when they were making those videos, I'm especially thinking about stuff like the flicker films and those sort of things, were sort of about how do we take this sort of physiological act of seeing and break it down for people, right? So the flicker films are essentially, what is a individual frame sequenced together, and the human brain tries to make it animate or tries to make sense of it. So in the case of Tony Conrad's The Flicker, it was your body tried to make sense of a bunch of flickering images, and you saw things move, and maybe you saw colors that didn't exist in it. And then I think in other things, in other cases, there are other films where they're maybe trying to highlight that a film is 24 frames per second, but each of those frames is its own thing, right? So you can almost think about Mothlight is kind of a film, but it doesn't really animate, right? It's like every individual frame is its own sequence, and your brain again sort of maps these to movement, but that's not necessarily the case for all of these films. So I thought it'd be good. We haven't talked a lot in this class about machine learning as sort of the theory underpinning it. We've just been sort of having fun with some of the tools of machine learning. So that we'd go back and maybe look at how machines quote unquote see. So I know for some of you who have maybe taken previous classes with me, this might be a little bit of a refresher, but it'll be pretty short, and then we'll jump into actually making something cool, using some of this theory. So what does a neural network see? How does it work in the way that we visualize things, right? Because we know that we've been able to make new images from other images, or detect things how do we detect body poses? How does a machine learning model actually do that? And the way it does it is by what's called deep learning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, but you probably have heard, AI, machine learning, deep learning. All of these phrases have been probably in some way intermingled, to the point of where they probably all sound the same, but they're slightly different. And deep learning in particular has a very particular meaning. So this is an example. If you haven't ever watched any of Gene Kogan's videos, I highly recommend it. I think I linked to this particular lecture here. He made a cool little tool, I believe in Open Frameworks, that just sort of lets you see how various layers of a machine learning model work. And so deep learning sounds like it's quote unquote, there's some deep meaning to it. What it really means is that it's a bunch of stacks of images, or a bunch of stacks of essentially textures. So when you hear the phrase deep learning, what they really mean is that there are multiple layers in a model, and those layers stacked up to do a certain task. So in the case of a GAN, like a generator, it's to make new images. In the case of a classifier, it's to detect, is this human pose in a certain position, or is it a classification of animals, right? So is it a zebra? Is it a horse? A cat? Is it a dog? Those sort of things. So this is the very first layer of sort of how a neural network works, right? So you'll also hear these as called convolutional layers. Convolution is actually, it comes from pre-machine learning era computer vision, and essentially all it means is edge detection. Or a way to think about a convolution is, have you ever used well, actually, maybe 3D glasses. You know how you have a red panel and a blue panel in a 3D glass? And if you close one eye, it just filters out all the stuff that isn't, it filters out blue, so it leaves other colors. And if you close the other eye, you filter out red. That's essentially what these models are doing, except what they're doing is they're filtering out for certain textures. So in the case of this sort of image here, so this is running off of Gene's webcam. You can sort of see what this particular model is, or this particular layer or image is looking for, is sort of edges that are the top of things, right? So in this case, it's catching the top of his jacket, the top of these computer displays, the top of his head. So this thing is looking for top edges. In other cases, like maybe say this one, it looks like this might be looking for maybe the vertical edge of an image, right? So it's catching this side of his head, this side of his jacket, that sort of thing. And you can think about this as like, okay, if you look for something that is the horizontal, and you look for something that's vertical, and you combine those two together, you look for edges, you look for corners, right? Basically, this will find a corner. And that's essentially the process of these models is each one looks for an individual layer, and each layer builds up into really complicated material. So you'll often hear people talk about the lower layers versus the higher layers of a machine learning model, especially a deep learning model. And this is essentially the process. So if we take in a picture of, say, a dog, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to break all that up into pixels, and there'll be just like a basic like pixel layer. Then we'll do sort of that edge detection, right? And this edge detection is like, what's the top of the dog? What's the bottom of the dog? What's the left side, right side? Maybe angles. This might also be something like looking for curves. You could look for a curve instead of, a straight line. That gets added together. So we sort of take all of these individual layers and begin to combine them, right? So what happens when you look for a top left curve and a bottom right curve? Maybe that starts to mean you're looking for circles. Because these are also RGB images, you also need to think about the individual color layers. So in addition to looking for the top left and right of things, you might also be looking for where there's more red or where there's more green, or where there's a green edge and a blue edge, and like all this stuff begins to combine. And as you begin to go up and up these stacks, you might begin to say, like, now we're looking for some like eyeballs or photographics like heads, or in the case of something like a dog, if you're classifying different types of dogs, maybe you want to look at the ear shape or the texture of their fur, those sort of things. So the important thing to know with deep learning layer is that quite often all you're really specifying is the pixels as well as the classifier out, and then the machine learning model is trying to figure out internally like what are the best representations of this model. In most cases, all edges are going to be sort of predefined, or like it'll quickly determine like I need to know the top layer, I need to know what right is, what a curve is, those sort of things. But as you begin to build up these higher layers, it's going to depend a lot more on the data that the model sees, right? So it's seeing a bunch. If you're just determining between dogs and cats, these higher layers aren't going to know what a fish looks like, or these higher layers aren't going to know, what I don't know, what a painting looks like. So the deep is really that they're what we would describe as hidden layers, or layers that we're not specifying. So there's an input, there's an output, and then the magic of quote unquote of machine learning is that like it determines everything that goes on inside this model. So prior to machine learning, or prior to this sort of type of machine learning, we would actually go in, and this is what we did with like early computer vision, is we go in and define every convolution. So if you've ever done convolution kernels, it's like you give weights to a grid, you pass a little window over the image, and it determines like here's where like this thing stands out, right? So we did a lot of that manually. And now the process of machine learning through sort of training a model is that internally all these weights are determined inside of it. That's all deep learning is. So if anyone talks to you about deep learning and like tries to make it sound like it's more complicated, all it really means is you've got these layers inside. These layers and these neurons stack up into new things, and that then allows us to internally inside the model process what this thing is, and then we can combine our inputs and outputs to get answers out of it. For a long time, this was thought of as a quote unquote black box. What we're going to look at today is some tools that actually allow us to visualize what these layers and what these neurons look like, so that we can begin to almost kind of infer like how this thing works. So again, just to reiterate, like in a very dummy version, like if you were to pass a zebra image through this model, you might certain neurons, you'll hear these referred to as neurons, would fire as like more prominent, right? So maybe this is a neuron that looks for zebra stripes, or like hard black and white stripes. And this will be a little bit stronger. Or maybe this looks for something like, again, remember these are pure photographs. So sometimes even stuff like, is it on the grass or is it in sky behind it, right? If there's sky behind it, maybe it's a bird. It looks for all sorts of sort of random details based on the images that it finds. And from that, it's able to infer like, hey, I think this is a zebra. If you were to compare that to maybe a cat, like maybe the cat actually does fire sort of similar neurons in the sense that it's got these like striped patterns. But other things like maybe the eyes and the ear shapes help it determine that this is actually more of a cat image than a zebra image. So that's deep learning in a nutshell. Some of these could be language models, right? So if you have words coming in, the combination of, or I guess it would be maybe almost be letters here, the combination of letters into words, into grammatic structures could then help you determine, who the author is, what language it's in, those sort of things. There's a bunch of different applications for deep learning. So we're going to look at, for maybe the next 10, 15 minutes, is a tool called OpenAI Microscope. I'll drop the link in here for folks. So OpenAI is one of the big research labs for machine learning. And they, a couple years ago, built this really, really cool tool called the Microscope. And what this does is, as I mentioned, those layers or those neurons inside of each of these models can be visualized. And we're going to look at these in just a minute to sort of understand how these things work. So if you've never done machine learning, or maybe you've taken this class and you have heard a couple of these phrases, you might have heard of things called inception or VGG. What this is a bunch of very popular machine learning models that tend to be the backbone for computer vision. And they've gone through and actually done the process of turning these weights and these sort of like layer systems into visualizations. So you can visualize what each of these layers and individual neurons looks like. So I think probably the best two, if you're just going to play with this, I would look at VGG19 and Inception V3. These are probably the two most popular machine learning models. ResNet is also a very popular one. But I would probably say start with these two and just dig around. So what's also helpful here is that you can even see these little graphics here on the left in gray are how the model network is structured. So you'll see VGG is a very straight, flat layer. It just goes through each layer. Inception is kind of a more complicated structure in that there's sort of these internal structures that get combined and flattened into individual networks, and then there's these other ones inside here. So each of these will have their own weights and their own neurons attached to it. So you will see these layer names also represented everywhere. So let's just go ahead and click on Inception v3 and take a look at this. So when we talk about lower layers, we're basically talking about the bottom of these graphs. And if you look just at this high level representation, you'll see here that the high level, or sorry, the low level, I guess would be the best way to describe this. You'll see almost like pixel values, right? And they look like RGB noise essentially. As you begin to go up a little bit higher, you'll start to see that these things combine into structures, right? Like this is starting to look like, kind of stripy. This is starting to look like, I don't know, like cells or that sort of thing. And as you get further and further up, you get to things that almost look like weird, noisy photographs. And that's essentially, this is the process of these things being built up and added to each other, right? So again, at the bottom, we have almost pure pixel values. As the pixels get added together and inside of each of these structures are different representations or different, layer combinations, then we get stuff like stripes, and then we get up to full body representations. So this is just the way to look at sort of the overall structure of a model. But the really cool thing, and the thing that we're going to play with the most today, is that you can click into these individual neurons and look at how things are added together. So if you've ever played with Deep Dream or done style transfer, you might have seen these names even referenced before. Mixed 5C, mixed 5B, mixed 5D. These are layer names for the individual networks and are also very commonly used to do stuff like Deep Dream. So if we click into one of these, let's click into one of the early ones. Let's do 5B. So see, inside of 5B are a bunch of these individual neurons, and you'll see that each of these is doing sort of a different thing, right? Like this is clearly looking for stuff like dots. This, I don't know, this almost looks like watermelon it's looking for. Down to, here are different types of dots, right? This is white on black. Here's a different, maybe size, maybe scale. You can see different structures that these things are looking for. So this is really helpful to just sort of understand that, this is the individual neurons that are firing when an image is passed through. And if you want to click on one of these, you can see as well what sort of images tend to be represented the strongest within this, right? So if an image is passed through, this neuron glows or pings the loudest when it sees images like this. So it's looking for I see a lot of blues and yellows which kind of makes sense, right? You see a lot of blues and yellows represented here, kind of like diagonal stripes, um, you know, those sort of things. So this is really helpful just to understand what this particular model and what this particular neuron is looking for. I also just think the visualizations of this are kind of fun. So we go and click on a different one. Let's click on this green one. This looks more green dotish. So you'll see it seems to tend to find a lot of like small little dots, yellow dots, green dots, finds the leaves, those sort of things. So this is, even though it says 5, it's like actually a fairly low layer because it's mixed 5B. If we go to, let's say, like mixed 6A, now you'll see that these are starting to build up like more complex structures, right? You're not necessarily seeing individual green dots. I guess you could sort of say like this one has some green dots, but also has these black and white stripes. So if we click into this one, let's see what this finds. So this tends to find a lot of areas where I guess green texture exists with both black in it as well. Kind of makes sense. It also oddly finds people. So, again, like these do serve multi-purposes. So it's helpful to sort of know what these multiple purposes are. If we go, let's go up even higher layers. Let's go to 7A. Actually, let's go all the way up to 7B. Okay, so now we're getting these really, really complicated structures. And if you click into one of them, it's kind of hard to see. I think Inception is a little bit harder to read. We'll look at VGG next. I think VGG is a little bit easier to read from just like a human perspective. But if you click into one of these, let's click into this one. See how this has this sort of like spirally thing? I wonder if this is going to find like spiral snail things or something. Okay, interesting. Not what I expected. This is the toilet paper roll. 158 is a bunch of dogs. So let's see. Yep, so there's our dog. There's a particular type of dog. It tends to be smaller dogs. And here's what this visualizes as. You can kind of see it finds eyes, right? So one thing, the reason these look so trippy is because it's trying to find this particular texture across an entire image, right? So you can imagine a dog is sometimes in the bottom right corner of an image, sometimes in the top left, sometimes it's in the top right. So it's trying to sort of like generalize where it can find these dog photos. And that leads to like these very sort of trippy shapes. So this is interesting. This is the dog filter as well as the camera lens filter, as well as, I don't know, a stopwatch filter. So again, these cover multiple categories, and then you get sort of the combination weights of things as a way to sort of determine like, okay, what makes this the camera, what makes this photo a camera lens versus a dog is not just 158 is weighted this way, but also maybe 32 or something is weighted this way. So it takes all of these combinations and is able to make a determination from there. Does that make sense? Any questions? Cool. So let's take a look at VGG because just I think it's a little bit, the structure is a little bit easier to understand. So this is like very easy to sort of, you can see the pixels add up. Now you get textures. They add up until you get more complicated forms. And now if we go to our very high layer here, you can kind of maybe see like this looks like octopus or something like, right? So let's click in here and see what it finds. Maybe they don't, for some of these, they don't have the data or like what data sets are visualized with it. So let's try one of these and see if we get them. This one looks like mushrooms. Let's see if we get mushrooms here. Yep. So this is the mushroom layer. So I'll say VGG is a little bit easier to read. The downside, or the reason that people tend to use Inception more, is Inception tends to be a little bit better because it's not purely these RGB values. It turns out that structure, that sort of like collapse, expand, tends to give us better results. So you'll see that the VGG stuff tends to be used for really default or really basic examples. But it's also a little bit easier for us as humans to read. So it's kind of like fun to see like, Yeah, I think this one is going to find mushrooms. Or let's go back here. Let's see if there's another one in here that we can guess. This again looks like maybe dog eyes or something. Yeah, also you can see the neurons here as well. That's very clearly a dog. So here is our visualization of dogs. Right, these are Yorkies. I don't know dog breeds that well. Is that what these are? Something like that. So it finds this particular type of dog very very well through this layer. Um, so I definitely recommend that you dig through these and kind of play with them. There are a couple of special models in here. You'll see AlexNet places and Inception V1 places. So these are less sort of broad categories of images or animals, and probably more about locations or like landscapes. So you might find some interesting values in this particular model because of that. Like let's go to one of these higher layers here. Yeah, so you can see the structures for this one are far more architectural than they are animal. Like this one still looks like an animal. So maybe there are some animals. Yeah, there's probably dogs in a lot of locations, but there's also this one is really about finding windows. Yep. So this is a window finder, that sort of thing. So I will often come back to this model just because for stuff like style transfer or deep dream, these become really important tools for us to sort of visualize. So deep dream, if you've never played with it, is essentially this process, but almost in reverse. So what you do is you provide a image let me just Google deep dream. I'm sure people have seen these images before, but just in case you haven't. So what you do with deep dream is essentially you give it an image and you say, I want to overemphasize a particular neuron or a particular layer. And what that then gives you is like over an iterative process, it slowly moves the image more toward the look of one of those layers. So you can sort of see like, you could take I don't know what this image was at one point, maybe like people, and you can, through an iterative process, sort of overemphasize the dog layer of this photo. So what it'll do is it'll find anything that even remotely resembles a dog, and it'll sort of strengthen that image toward a dog. And you do that over and over and over again until you get these very trippy images. So we're actually going to look at the guy who invented Deep Dream. His name is Alexander Mortmantsev. We're going to actually look at the tool that he's been working on over the past couple of years, which is called Cellular Automata. But this is a very common sort of thing that will come up over and over again. So it's helpful to sort of know at least the basics of what this means, because if you are playing with another neural net model and you see something that says like, what layer do you want to represent? Mixed 5B, mixed 6C, then you can sort of say, oh, let me go to the open microscope and see what those options mean and how we go find them. People love using Mona Lisa, so here's the Mona Lisa as a dog. So yeah, definitely like a fun tool to play with, and I highly recommend it. So we're going to actually do for the next part of this lecture is we're going to take some of these textures here. So we'll take maybe some of the earlier textures from our model. Let's go to V3. We'll take some of these early layers. So we'll take maybe images like this, and we're going to actually make them move. So we're going to animate them. We're going to do that using, as I mentioned, a tool called Cellular Automata. So the notebook for that is here. So let me just grab the link for this, paste it into our chat. So we'll get this set up, and then what we're going to do is we'll take a break. Oops, sorry about that. We'll take a break as we begin to do a little bit of training. Training takes a couple minutes in this particular model, so we'll do that. If you ever have trained like a StyleGAN model, you know that training StyleGAN takes days, weeks, months. Training for these is a lot shorter. It takes maybe an hour in some cases, maybe less. So what we'll do is we'll get started, and then we'll pick a couple of textures, and then we'll train them, and then we'll look at the animations after our break. So I'm just going to take a sip of my tea because my voice is starting to go. All right, so this is called Neural CA. I often will shorthand it to NCA. The CA stands for Cellular Automata. Any of you who have done like basic programming or coding, generative art type of stuff have probably heard of Cellular Automata. It's essentially a large category of different tools to try to represent textures in real life, right? So a lot of this tends to be reaction diffusion stuff. If you've never seen reaction diffusion, it's basically a way to generate stuff that kind of looks like zebra stripes. It has a very naturalized look while still being very patterned and textural. So the whole theory behind this, so there's actually two articles that if you want to go read, you're more than welcome to. That won't affect whether or not you can do this lecture, but I think they're fairly readable and discusses sort of how to. Basically, the idea here was what Alexander and other researchers were really interested in was that in biology and in the real world, a lot of animals can regrow themselves, right? So like lizards can regrow a limb or that sort of thing. What they were interested in doing is sort of in a toy idea, how can we generate a machine learning model that can regrow itself? So there's also some really, really fun demos to play with. So I definitely recommend just going in here and playing with these demos. So this is an example of, this is a machine learning model has been designed to draw this lizard, and you can go in and destroy parts of the lizard and it kind of regrows itself. And if you obliterate too much of the lizard, it kind of is screwed. It doesn't really do much. But there's, a bunch of different examples of this. And basically the idea here was we want to be able to regrow a model. And if you destroy too much of it, sometimes what ends up happening is, it redraws itself, but not as well, or it redraws itself in a different setup. So there's a ton of different examples in this particular model. It goes in and, this is the actual, if you're really interested in actually how a machine learning model is structured, this is the actual structure of this machine learning model. I just tend to go in and read sort of the analogies. I find if you read the analogous descriptions, you can sort of understand what they're attempting to do, even if you don't understand the math. So we're going to look at is actually more of this second link, which is called self-organizing textures. So the idea here is that we can take a single image and we can train a machine learning model to actually render those textures. It will begin to learn how these textures should be represented. And you'll see in here that you can sort of pick different models. So we can pick like a checkerboard. And it can begin to represent itself. And then what we're going to do in this class, actually, we're going to take some of these inception layers and animate them. So what you're able to do is you're able to, I don't know, this looks like the bird eye version, and you're going to be able to animate it. We're also going to be able to do is combine textures. So we'll be able to combine two textures together and animate them. And then we can also use a tool of using black and white masks to also animate our masks. And then we can create some kind of fun, almost direct animation style sort of animations. So I highly recommend going through these articles. It's really cool that they made a bunch of demos that you can play with and sort of see. There are a lot of videos as well in these, where you can sort of say here's what happens over the process of generating one of these textures. They start out kind of noisy and they begin to structure themselves over time. And the idea here is that what they really wanted to do is they wanted to be able to create a neural network model that could take any texture, or quote unquote any texture, and begin to self-represent it, right? So no matter what, it would figure out how to generate this texture, and then using some perturbations in the way the system works, actually be able to animate it. So this one comes up quite often because a really cool artifact of this particular model is that the bubbles are self-spacing. You'll see that when it starts, the bubbles are sort of close to each other, but they end up actually figuring out how to space themselves correctly based on the texture image. So there's just lots of cool stuff to play with. And I find this is a fun, again, it sort of gets back to that very early experimental film of just take an image and be able to animate it. So I think there's some fun stuff with these textures. One thing to note is there's also some nice failure cases in here. I really appreciate when a model or when researchers talk about what doesn't work. So these are some examples. So we'll definitely as you play with this, you might decide I want to try something taking a really realistic photo and applying that to this model. And you'll see that when they take a sprinkled cupcake and they try to apply this texture generator to it, it does not work very well. This particular model is good for low level textures, but it is not great at other things. It's also bad at representing color. In this case, like a Mondrian photo, which you would think it could represent, tends to fall apart. And also you saw that there was a black and white checkerboard that worked well, but yet the color checkerboard doesn't. So when you play with this, you will probably find that certain images just don't work well. And you'll kind of like end up in a place where like you kind of find what works well and what doesn't. One of the things I think is really fascinating is that because you can think about this is how machines see. So if we feed these back into a machine to generate itself, it kind of works. Like it just like by default, like there's something like sort of like cyclical about this idea of like if a machine sees like this, then we could also ask it to represent or generate these new images because it like is like sort of bare bones like understanding of how a machine can see. So it's also able to kind of replicate a lot of these. All right, so let's get started with actually generating these. So as I mentioned, like this notebook is almost completely done by Alexander Mortentsev. I'm more or less grabbing it and adding a couple cool things for animations. But I highly recommend, he's got a bunch of video tutorials where he talks about how he like thinks about these things. Some really cool stuff. I highly recommend watching it if you want to. So we'll get started with just this first cell. So this first cell is just going to install a bunch of code for us. So we'll go ahead and run this. And it should also tell us at the end what sort of GPU we have. So I have a V100. If you have a K80 or a P100 or whatever, like anything lower than a V100, you probably should still be able to do all of these tasks. I don't think there's really like a GPU limit to this. It'll probably just be a lot slower. So when we do the training, your training might take a little bit longer. Run the next cell, which just like, again, installs a bunch of code for us. And we'll run this other cell, which sort of determines. So Alexander Mortentsev was the inventor of Deep Dream. He was also really heavily involved in style transfer stuff. So a lot of this is actually like conceptually very similar to style transfer and Deep Dream. So you'll see that he's using a model called VGG16 to actually pull the styles out of images. And this is the actual neural CA network model, which is very, very small. One of the cool things that they've been able to do since the initial run of this paper is they've now made this into a version that could also be generated on OpenGL or GLSL. So if anyone's interested in doing like shader stuff, you could actually convert these to shaders now, which is really, really cool. Being able to move a machine learning model into a shader is kind of amazing to think about how compressed you can make these. So this is all the model is. This is a very, very, very small neural network. Okay, the next part that's going to be fun, and you can either do it now or you can do it during our break, is to find a couple textures. So I've added a file here. There's just sort of a bunch of pre-built textures and network models that I'll be able to use to like just sort of go through training a bit quicker. But if you want to, so you can run this cell, and I'll just download all the files that I've gone ahead and done. Your other option is to go and find textures yourself. So you could go into OpenAI Microscope and maybe say like, oh, I really want to generate this diamond texture. So you can click on this and then just go save image as. And I definitely recommend like saving these with a name that makes sense. So Inception V3, channel 43. You may want to go into like, if you want to do like really be solid about being able to check your homework later, even naming the layer is really helpful. So you can just save that. And then what you do is just say show in Finder. Or you can upload directly. So we can just go ahead and upload. Where did my image go? There it is. So you can also feel free to like go on the internet and grab textures. One thing I will say is that, again, you're more likely to find failure states if you aren't using the OpenAI models. The other thing to know is that if you give it a really like geometric texture, it's likely to sort of turn it into a little bit of organic shapes. So play with it, see what you can make. I tend to think of these more as a texture generator than a pattern generator, because patterns are a little bit harder to represent. Textures tend to be a little bit more natural, but you do you. See what you want to do. So the next thing we want to do is we actually just want to list out each of these images out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy the path of this, and I'm going to just go through and list each image that I want to represent. So you're going to give it a path. So the second part here is a path, and the first part here is a name. So let's just go inv3, since this is inception v3, and then we'll just give it c41. So you're just giving these images a name, just so you can later represent, or like later use these as a variable. So inside the NCA folder, if you ran that, you'll also see there's a couple other images in here. So let's go ahead and use these. So I'll copy each of the paths in here. So this is ResNet50, so I'll just do RN50, and we'll do C13. RN50 and C79. And lastly, we have C96, RN50. Okay, so now that we've put in all these paths, and again, you can feel free to upload your own and do whatever you want with this, you can run this cell. And let's just sort of show you what these images are. So this just helps make sure that, like, yes, I've labeled these correctly and I have the images being loaded in correctly. So now what you want to do is let's start by just taking one image, and we'll render it as a video. So I'm going to take this first one, which is that one I downloaded from OpenAI Microscope. And you're just going to take the variable name and paste it into this first line. So target name equals this. So basically what we're saying is we want to make sure that we can generate this image or this texture. Let's go ahead and run this. I'm just going to load it in to say, like, here's the image. And then this is going to just get us set up to start our training loop. And we'll run this. So now over here, you should see that we have a thing called init.pt. So this is a quote-unquote initialized model. PT stands for PyTorch, since we're using PyTorch here. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with this model, which is represented here by init, and we're going to train our neural cellular automata model to begin to generate this texture. Now, how does it do that? So basically, this is a GAN, and we haven't talked too much about GANs in this class, but style GAN is obviously also a GAN. What it's going to do is it's going to, over time, basically generate this image as best it can, and then it's going to figure out where it failed, and then it's going to learn how to better represent that image over time. So in this cell here, this is actually our training loop. So what we're going to do is for 4,000 steps, we're going to repeatedly sort of create this. We're going to generate an image, try to have the model figure out what worked or what didn't, learn to do a better image, and then it's going to do it over and over again. Now, 4,000 steps is probably going to take us 20 minutes. So for this version, I'm going to set this to be much smaller. I would say 4,000 is probably about the right step to start with. We'll talk a little bit about how to tell whether you're at a good point or not by using our loss curve, but I'll come back to that in a minute. I'm going to set this to be a little bit smaller. I'm going to set it to be 2,000, and I'll let it run over break, and then we can come back and look at it. But once you run this cell, what it's going to do, actually, let's just do it. We can run this cell. And what you'll see here is we've got step n. So this is how many times are we running through our range and updating this. And then you'll also see that along here, we're also getting new images being generated. So this is that model generating images. So you'll see it started by generating these really crappy images. And what it did is it's trying to learn how to better represent that diamond pattern as it goes through it. Above here is what's called our loss curve. The important thing to know is that you want your loss curve to get smaller and go more and more down toward the right. So over time, we're seeing this is slowly getting better, and these numbers happen to represent like essentially a score. So we want our score to be, the challenge here is we don't actually want our score to be completely zero. Completely zero will lead to a thing called overfitting. What we want is our score to be as low as possible, but still like good. So I find a last score about 200 tends to be about best here. So as this begins to generate, you should see this curve sort of look like I don't know, an inverted hockey stick, right? It like goes down and to the right, and at the right, it should be like, it should spend a little more time here. And you can also see from the outputs, you can see here that like we're getting that better sort of diamond pattern. And if I come up here, you'll see, okay, I'm getting the diamond pattern, but it looks like I'm getting mostly purple and green, and I'm not getting as much of the orange. Again, colors are a little tricky with this model. If you have too many colors in your image, it tends not to represent all the colors particularly well. But we'll see. We're just going to keep training this for a little bit longer. So you'll see it. I'm about 600 now. So we're about almost halfway, or about 2/3 of the way through, or 1/3 of the way through training this model. So let's do this. Let's take a break. If you are training a model, maybe you want to set yours for a little bit higher, like 3,000, 4,000. Run it. Let's see how long it actually takes. And when we come back, we'll see how to create a video from this to be able to see if this thing works. So why don't we come back at, let's come back at 8:30 or 8:30 my time. So we'll come back at 30 after, and we'll pick this up and we'll look at how to do this. If your model does finish, what you might want to do is train a second model. And to train a second model, what you'll do is you'll go back up here, you'll grab the second, like another variable name, and you'll go through the exact same steps. So you'll paste this in here, you'll change this out here, and then you'll run this cell again, and then you'll run this cell again. So if you get to 2 models by the time we get back, that's great, but if not, that's totally fine. So yeah, let's come back at 30 after, and we'll see how our model has done. All right, see everybody in 7 minutes. All right, so my model has finished. It looks like my loss is at 101, which is a pretty low. Again, you don't really want this to be 0. 0 will turn into what we call overfitting. Overfitting has the problem of like it'll just repeat stuff, and we won't necessarily get animations. I've actually never really explored overfitting too much in this model, so I don't really know what the real outcome would be. But just know you generally don't want your loss to be 0, because that means it's pretty like you want a low loss, but nothing that's 0. But you will see my loss curve over time dropped really quickly at the beginning, and now it's sort of like slowly getting there. So I will say I find that about a range of 3,000 to 4,000 tends to be a little bit better. You can kind of see in these images that maybe we're not getting exactly the best structure, but it looks pretty good. Again, I would love to maybe get a little bit more of the orange in here, but this may be an issue with just how these models train. And if you refresh our Finder over here, you'll see that now you have a new model called init, which means it started from the initial position, and it also has our new name here, right? So in Inception v3, channel 41. So this contains all of the weights of our model, and now we can use this to actually generate a animation. So come down here, and this creates a function that just basically like starts the model, and then it will over time just sort of change the noise underneath the model a little bit and generate animation for us. And this last step here is we're actually to pass in the path. So I'm going to delete this here. So we want to pass in the path to our model. So we'll grab this here, copy path, and we'll paste it in here. Run it. And here you'll see it's generating our frames. So this is generating 300 frames. By default, this does 30 frames per second. This is going to generate a 10-second animation. And this should generate an animation that you can also play in this space, which is nice, but it does take a little bit of time to actually generate it. So here's our video. We can go ahead and hit play. And so there's our diamond texture. So this is moving pretty fast. There are ways to manage the speed a little bit. This number here, the step n, what this is looking for is, I think it's looking for, I don't know, it's looking for some value or the minimum of 8. We could actually just make this step n equals 8. By default, I think it does 16, which is fast. So if you make the number smaller, you should get a slower animation. Let's see if that works. Let's go ahead and play. Feels like it's moving a little slower. You can make that number even smaller if you wanted to. One thing to note is that these models do always start with these like sort of grayish noise. And that's because the model is sort of taking that noise and that's how it's figuring out how to build the texture from it. We'll look later at a way to maybe like sort of cut that out before we generate our video. So this is our generating our video path. You'll also notice that inside that NCA folder that I downloaded unzipped, there are a couple models in here as well. So if we want to grab one of these models and play one of these just to sort of see what it looks like, we can do that. Okay, so we can go ahead and hit play here. So here we can see a different model. So this is the, and this is what, C13. So if I come over here and double click this, so it's supposed to generate this, and you'll see it kind of gets close. It's not as good a contrast, but it does sort of generate the cell look of this thing. This one feels a lot slower, so maybe I would set this to 12 or 16 or something to make it move a little bit faster. So the process for this is always to just like, if you want to generate a bunch of different textures like over and over again, the goal is just to like make sure you save them as a variable here, then take your variable name, stick it in the next cell, hit return, run this cell, make sure you run this cell again, and make sure it always says init because you want to initialize from zero noise, and then run this again. So you can run this and you'll generate many, many different textures. So I've got C13 and C96 here as well. So we can look at what C96 is. Paste that in here. So that's the process of training these. It's pretty fast, right? Like if you've trained any other GAN before, you know it takes hours or days or weeks. This is very nice in that it's very quick. The other cool thing about this is that this generates sort of a patch at 256 by 256, but we can actually scale that to any size. So if you wanted to make that 256 by 256 like tileable into like 1080 by 1080, you can. And we'll look at an example of that in a minute as well. So it's kind of nice that it is also, because they're repeatable, you can also repeat these in a nice sort of fashion. So here's 96. So by default, we can just sort of generate these cool textures that sort of animate, right? And we can control the speed a little bit. Again, we can make this run a little bit faster if we set the step to 16 and run it again. So there's some control here, which is pretty cool. And that gets to the basics of just like take an image and animate it. I would definitely recommend playing with different types of textures. Again, there was that example in the failure states of a sprinkled cupcake. You could try it again, see if you get different results with a different cupcake image or that sort of thing. Try more photorealistic things and see what happens. In my experience, these tend to work best with textures, but I think it's totally worth exploring and seeing what you get with other results. So here it's moving a little bit faster. You can kind of see the cloud-like shapes are moving up and down a little bit faster. So that just gets us images animating, which is cool. But what we really want to do is like actually be able to maybe combine some of these textures and like use multiple textures in an image to get different animations and that sort of thing. So the way to do that in this particular setup is to use a mask. And you might think of masks as something in Photoshop where you're able to like hide a certain piece. But the way to think about it is just, so this is a little bit of code that will generate a circular mask for us. So we run this cell. You'll see here we have a black and white image. And the way to think about this is that what we want to do is that when the image is all white, we want to use one of our models. And when the image is all black, we want to use one of the other models. And in the middle, where it's gray values, we kind of want to be able to combine the two, right? So we want to be able to say like, okay, take my cloud shapes and take my cell shapes and combine them. And what happens in the middle when they're combined? So that's what we're going to look at next. So we're going to take this mask, and then we're going to load in both of our models. So I'll take these two models that are already finished, and we'll load them in. So we'll take this one. And by finished, I mean they trained for a little bit longer, so I know they're going to work. And we'll paste this one in. So I forget the order, but I believe CA1 will show up when there's black, and CA2 will show up when there's white. If not, you just reverse them and it works. So we'll now run this. So what this is actually doing is it's going to compute both of these at the same time, and it's going to apply the mask. So it says where there's a mask, where it's black, where it equals 1, we want to use CA1, and where it's 0, which is, wait, am I doing that math right? No, it's white is 1, right? White is 1. So where it's white, it'll be CA1, and where it's black, it'll be CA2. So this will basically compute the math for us. So now we're going to run this cell, and what this will do is it'll just generate a similar video, but should give us a circle in the middle with different textures. And I screwed up here. This is actually set to 600 frames. So if you want this to render faster, you can set it to 300. It seems like it's going pretty quickly, so we'll be fine here. All right, so our frames are rendered. Now we need to just wait to see what the video output looks like. Loading video into Collab is so slow. If you wanted to save this file out, what you could do is here on line 4 where it says with video writer, if you pass in a path afterward, so content test.mp4, what this will do is it'll actually just render the video and it won't actually be playable, but it'll render a video here that you could then download to play with. I really hate how slow video rendering is in Colab. Okay, so now when we hit play here, we should see both of our textures together, and we do. So we see in the center, we see our clouds, and in the outside, we see our cells. In the middle, well, we see kind of this crappy color. So this isn't really what we expect, right? Like what we would expect is something that is both clouds and cells, or like some combination of those two. And the reason this is happening is a machine learning thing that we'll talk about next, which is how to fix this, which is transfer learning. So if you've taken my StyleGAN class, you know transfer learning is a way to transfer from a previously trained model into the next model. And basically the way to think about this is that we have two models that were initialized using random variables at separate times. And the problem is that because they were initialized randomly separately, they don't have any weights in combination to each other, right? So it's almost like someone who's learned Spanish and someone who's learned French, like separately, like they technically should be able to speak to each other, at least in some terms, right? Because there's some Romance languages that have similar phrasing or similar structures, but because they've been taught in isolation, they don't really know how to combine. So what we're going to do next is a technique called transfer learning. What we're going to do is we're going to take one of our models that's already been trained, and we're going to train the other image off of that model. And what we're going to find is we're going to get much better textures between that. So the way to do that is in the next cells. So let's go ahead and grab one of our images that we've trained here. So we'll start with C96, which I believe is, okay, so actually we'll start with 13. So 13 was our cloudy sort of texture. Or sorry, 13 is our cell texture, 96 is our cloud texture. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with 13, which is this model here, right? And actually what I need to do, I need to move it out of this folder. The way that the file structure here is set up is we just want to move it out of our folder. So if you just drag it outside of your folder path, you can do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to, down here, last our video, we're going to go through the same process we went before, but we're going to make one or two minor changes. So first things first, we want to actually reference our image. So we're going to pull from 96. So we're going to copy this path. We're going to paste it in here, and we're going to run this cell. What did I do wrong here? Oh, here's what I did wrong. Okay, so this is actually not looking for the path. This is looking for the variable name. So if you go back up here to the top here, you want to grab the variable name. So this was 96 is what I want. So we're going to grab 96, and we're going to use that instead of the path. If I run this, we should see our image here. Yep, there's our image. So now what we want to do next is, instead of previously what this was doing is was initializing from the initial state, which was basically the empty state. What we're going to do instead is we're actually going to transfer from this model. So what we want to do is we want to take the name of this, copy just the name, not the .pt, and paste that into this path. So what this is saying now is we're going to train this image, but we're going to start with this model. And what that'll do is it'll sort of like give us the best of both worlds. It'll take the weights that it already knows here, and it'll add additional weights into it from this. So go ahead and run this cell just to make sure that we are set up. And now we're going to run our training loop again. And the other key thing to know is when you do transfer learning, you don't need to run it for the exact same amount of time. Like before I said run it 3,000 to 4,000 steps. For this, you can run it for a lot less steps. So maybe like 1,000 or 2,000. So I'm just going to do 1,000 just sort of see what gets here. Also to just be a little bit faster. So I'll set this to 1,000. So the only thing we're really changing here is maybe how long our model trains for, and where the parent or like the initial model is being trained from. So go ahead and run this. What you'll see is the first step, instead of that being that gray or the pink that we saw before, is actually the initial model that we trained from, right? So remember that we're pulling from this image, or we want to generate this image. We want to start with that other cellular, more like image. You'll see as it's training, it actually is sort of taking maybe the colors from the previous model and actually moving to this new sort of structural shapes, those sort of things. So again, I would probably do this for, if I were doing this like by myself and not in front of a live studio audience, I would set this to 2,000 steps instead of 1,000. But just so we're not sitting here waiting for this thing to train, I'm going to set it for a little bit shorter. But I do, as you see, when you refresh your folder over here, you'll see you get a new model, which is the R50C13 plus RN50C96. So basically what this, the way this naming convention works is saying it started from initial, then it added R50C13, and then it added R50C96. So I've actually already trained this, it's here. But just to sort of show how training works when you do transfer learning, it's essentially the same process. You'll still have a loss curve that you want to see going down, and your output images should get better over time. And for those of you who took transfer learning sort of like with StyleGAN, you'll learn that like this is actually like, to talk about languages, this is like, say you learn French and then you learn Spanish from French, because they have similar like underlying structures, it makes learning both a little bit easier. Is sort of maybe the analogy. That's a little bit of a rough analogy, but that's essentially what's going on here. This will generate better textures for both, and it will also give us that in-between step, because it's able to translate between these two models, because this one model contains both pieces of data in it, essentially. Now, the other thing that we'll note, and we'll look at this later, is that there is a problem, is that the more you transfer learn, the further away you get from your previous model, the less like the decay rate of that model happens over time. So like just be aware that like it's not perfect. You can't just like continue to load in textures and expect it to memorize everything. Like there's sort of like a, as you get further away from the initial model, it like loses that detail. So just be aware of that. Okay, cool. So now we have our two models here. So we've got C13 and C96, which contains both our initial model and our transfer learn model. So now we're going to go through the exact same step of using that mask. So we're going to use this mask from above, and we're just going to re-render it. So I'm going to set this to 300, it's a little bit faster. And I'm actually going to use, I'll use C13 here. And I'm actually going to use my previously, this one was transfer learned for 2,000 steps instead of 1,000. So it's probably slightly better. So I'm just going to use this path instead of the one that we just generated. And now we'll go ahead and use this. Because my mask is already saved, because I ran this cell up here, it already knows about my mask, so I don't need to rerun that cell. So go ahead and run this. One thing I should have noted is also that, remember how I said you could make the images larger? This was set to 512 by 512 instead of 256 by 256. So this render did come out larger. Now it doesn't scale up the texture, it just like tiles the texture. So just be aware of that.
I have a question.
Go for it. Yep.
So I'm following along, and under grafting, or the cell or the box that says grafting, I remember
Yep.
you got, yeah. So what do I put for the target name? Because I use my own textures.
Yeah, so make sure that if you named your textures up here in upload textures, and you passed in all the paths to them, make sure that you gave each of these names a variable that makes sense. And then, so when you render this, you should get each of these in order. So you're just going to use the variable name instead of the path name. All right, so here is my mask with transfer learned models. Let's see what it looks like. Cool. So here you can see you get much better texture in the middle, right? So now we're seeing the cell structure kind of blend into this cloud-like or mountain-like texture. So I uploaded on YouTube, I also have a little demo of both these side by side, so you can look at them side by side. So this is what it looks like with the two different examples. So on the left, we have the non-transfer learned model, and on the right, we have the transfer learned model. And you can see that it's much clearer, like this is what we would expect to see when you're blending two models together, right? And this only happens because of transfer learning. Because it knows both models simultaneously, it's able to transfer between those two. Now, one thing I didn't try because this kind of works well is I'd be interested to maybe do the reverse. So right now we're only setting the base model. So we're setting C13, and then we're setting the transfer learn model on top of it. I wonder what would happen if it would look any better if we took our 96 model and transfer learn 13 on top of it, and then did I guess you could call it B to A plus A to B, and use that. I actually haven't done that before. Maybe I'll try it this weekend, see if it leads to any better texture. But this looks pretty good already. Like I'm fairly happy with this. So this is kind of the fun of transfer learning, and this is the way that Alexander Mortentsev described this as, he calls it grafting. The idea of taking two tree limbs and combining them together to create a new tree, or like to graft a tree together. That's sort of the analogy that he's applying here. Cool. So any questions about that process? All right. So now I've got one more step here to play with, which is that you may have seen like, hey, we're generating a mask, which is pretty cool. What if we could animate this mask? And the fun thing is that because this mask is just black and white, this uses some, almost like shader-like code to generate our mask. But we don't have to do that. We could load in a black and white video and actually like use that as our mask. So that's what I've done here. So I'm just going to download these two videos really quickly. If they download quickly, let's see. So these are two black and white masks that I made. I believe I made them in After Effects. So you could make a black and white video essentially in any tool you want to, as long as it's black and white. And just remember that where it's blurry or gradated, that's where you get that sort of texture transfer. So if you make something that's just hard black and white lines, you could probably just drop that into After Effects and do the masking directly in there. What's sort of cool about this process is you get this this blended section, which like if you were to take this and try to do blended masks into like After Effects or Photoshop, you still wouldn't get this beautiful sort of like gradation between it. So that's kind of like the fun thing about this model. So what we're going to do here is I have a black and white mask that just does this, just scales up and down. But what we're going to do is we're going to read this mask in as an animation, and then we're going to be able to play this animation using our video. Let's go ahead and do that. So basically, the trick for this is that you can't just read in a video. You have to turn them into frames. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to make a folder in Colab called mask1. So there's our folder. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our video. So we're going to copy the path from our video. And we're going to paste that in. And this uses FFmpeg to just generate every individual frame from this video into our mask folder. So go ahead and run this cell. Cool, so we're done. So we come in here and we go to mask 1. See in here we have every individual frame of our animation. And it's important to note how long your animation is. So my animation is 450 frames. So make sure I use that going forward. Because if we don't, then that might lead to errors. So the next cell here is going to load in each of those images as a frame. The key here is we need to load it into our GPU. So there's like this code here is kind of funky. It basically just allows us to resize it and then load a black and white mask into our GPU. So if you upload a video that is a different size, make sure that you set the width and height. The other note here is I don't really understand why this happens, but this actually doubles the size of the video. So if I load in something that's 1920 by 1080, it's actually going to double the frame size to like 4K. So the trick here is just divide it by 2. So 1920 divided by 2 is 960. And this is 540. And then however long your video is, you also want to make sure you load in the frame count. So set the height and width. This should actually be divide height and width by 2. And then set frame count. Cool. So when you run this, it's just going to load in every single frame, store it in the GPU, and then it will spit out the very last frame just so we make sure that we've like actually generated the right video. Cool. So there is our very last frame of our video. Just make sure it loaded in correctly. And now we're going to take the exact same steps that we did before, which is we're going to grab our 2 videos here. I'm going to pause this. I don't know if it's going to crash anything, but just to be safe, we're just going to grab our 2 models, and we're going to use those again down here. So we're just going to paste this in. One other note is that I tend to find that this video writer tool, if you have too big of a video or if it's too long of a video, it'll actually crash Colab, which just leads to issues. So what I'm going to do is, like I mentioned before, I'm going to save this video out rather than rendering it in Colab. I'm just going to render it and save it to my Colab session, and then I'll download the file and we'll look at it there. So let's go ahead and run this. So make sure that you're set to So this is going to set our size here. The other thing I mentioned, remember how I mentioned that it starts out with that weird grayish value? So what we actually do is, we run a bunch of steps beforehand, which will basically skip that step. So if you run like 60 steps before during your video, it'll skip that step and you'll just get the good sort of like the juicy part of the texture animation, and then we'll actually animate from there. So this is where that frame count comes into steps. So see, I call this warm up. It just basically like warms up the model, and then we'll render out just the video for just the steps after that. Let's go ahead and run this cell.
Question.
Yeah, go for
Can
it.
you do that? Can you just copy and paste that code and use it for one video versus the
Yep.
graphic version? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can just take this code and run it. And again, for this K value determines speed. So 8 tends to be like a medium value. If you wanted to make it go twice as fast, quote unquote, you would double this to 16. If you want to make it run slower, you could set it to 4. So this kind of gives you a little bit of speed control depending on your own animation. Okay, and this saved out as noise mask, which is the wrong name. It's from a file I was using before, so I'm just going to use this as left mask. Hit X there. I'm going to download this. You can fit 4K video onto these, which is pretty amazing. So if you do render out that 1920 by 1080 version, and you left these values at 1920 by 1080, it would actually render out 4K, which, if any of you have done stuff with machine learning, you know that's very rare. But these models are so small that they tend to fit really. You can do a lot of stuff with them. So if you're really interested in doing high resolution, just know the challenge is that, again, that texture tiles rather than like scaling up. So at 4K, if you were to watch a 4K on your phone, like you're barely going to make out the texture in a lot of cases, which is kind of the challenge of these things. I wish Colab would download video faster, or download anything faster. So while this downloads, we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do next, which is, you can probably guess, we're actually going to generate 2 masks with 3 videos, or 3 models. So the process for that will be to transfer learn a third video, or a third model, which I won't do here, but I've got it saved here. So basically what I did is I took 79, which is this image, when it finishes loading. Uh-oh. I think maybe my internet kicked me off, but that's fine. It shouldn't be too broken here as long as this resets. Okay. Well, judging on how soon this comes back, let me just talk through the process. So we've got a model here, right, which is our new image, another image, which we pulled from all the way up the top up here. Right. So we're going from this image to this image to this image, and we're now transfer learning across 3 models. So the step is basically the same process, right? So you load in your target image, which is this image, and then what you do is, instead of feeding in that single step transfer learn model, you load in the larger one, which is the initial to A to B. So we're going to go from A to B to C. You will load that in, and then you will run your training step again. Again, you only need to do maybe 1,000 to 2,000 steps. And then what we'll do is we'll take in our second mask video. So these do have to be separate mask videos, right? So each one has to be black and white. So what I did is I generated one that was just purely the left-hand side of like the pulsing circle. And I took another one that was pulsing sort of alternately. And I saved out that mask separately. So they should be both pure black and white masks. We're going to run through the exact same steps here of just sort of separating them out. And then when you run this process, all you'll need to do is load in 3 different models, and then you will use 2 different masks. So this is wrong. So you actually uncomment that. So you use mask 1 and mask 2 together, and it will generate a video for you. I have no idea why Colab is kicking me off this, but I do have this on YouTube. So let me paste this link in for folks. So here is 2 masks. So you'll see that we have mask A and B, and then masks A, B, C is here. And one thing you should note is that, let me pause it here and scroll to here. Yeah, so here, so one thing to note is that it looks really good between these 2, but there's a little bit less of you get a little bit of that color halo here. And that's again because this particular model is ABC. So it has lost some of the knowledge between A, right? This is the A model. So what you might actually wanted to do is done um, AC. Maybe you should have transfer learned AC, and then there would be a little bit of a gap between these two, but you might get better quality here. This is kind of the challenge of transfer learning, is that the more models you transfer from each other, the knowledge of the earliest model gets lost, and then sometimes the visualization of this like kind of looks worse. Although I'm actually looking here, and it looks like the halo is about the same. So, this is just a case where if you get a mask where like you're starting to feel like you're losing some of the textural like transition, you may want to play with the order in which you translate models, or you may want to just play with how you mask things. So maybe these two masks never touch, and then it's only A, B, and AC. This is kind of the challenge of some of these tools, is that the models just can only hold so much data in them, and as you get further and further away, you might run into issues. All right, I don't know if this collab notebook is coming back, but it's basically a repetition process. So all we did that was different is we loaded in a different video, different mask, did the different transfer learning, that sort of thing. I should also mention at the bottom here, there are different ways of doing masking. So if you wanted to see how to do in Python, essentially how to do a mask that was sort of radiated in the middle, this code will do that for you. Then you can play this like show pair thing by loading into different models. Yeah, so there are lots of different ways to do this. I tend to find, because I hate trying to figure out how to do like mathematic gradations, I just load in images. So this code up here, let's see, where is it here? These two lines, let me just paste this at the end of this model here. So this will always load in your path. So if you go path to mask, so what this will do is this will just convert your mask to make sure it's in grayscale. It'll convert it to grayscale. It'll resize it according to whatever size you need. So do W equals 1920, H equals 1080. This will load in your mask, convert it to grayscale, resize it to the correct dimensions, and then this code here will append it and move it to the GPU, so it's usable on the GPU. So you can use this code anywhere. So if you want to load in a static mask that you would generate either in Photoshop or in After Effects or something, you could load this in and just use a hand-on mask, which I find far easier than trying to figure out how to mathematically do it. But if you are so inclined, you can figure out the math way to do it. Alexander is very good at doing that sort of stuff, so he understands what this mask means, and I look at it and I'm like, no, just let me draw that in Photoshop. So that's sort of like basically it for this. One other thing that is cool is, let me find the UNCA. So as I mentioned, they just released a version of this that can fit on a shader. Where is this? I'm trying to find the link to the GitHub where they have this. So UNCA collab. Okay, I will find the link to this. There's a collab that will convert your model into a GLSL shader. So people have been putting this on Shader Toy, I think. So let me just see if I go back So here are a bunch of the neurocellular automata that are loaded through shaders. So if you're a shader person, um, there's a way to output this as a shader, so you can then load it in. I don't know how the masking would work through shaders. I would assume it's probably possible, but I'm not the best at doing shader stuff. So just know that it's like pretty cool that you can take a machine learning model and narrow it down to the size of like that will fit on a shader now. So some pretty cool stuff there. All right, so that's everything I had for today. We would have stuck around for another 10 minutes to watch me do that demo, but it looks like this Colab notebook isn't going to really come back anytime soon. Maybe this is another one of those AWS issues. I would hope Google isn't running on AWS, but who knows? Anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much it for today. So again, you can play with generating different masks, generating different textures, and maybe make a cool little like sort of like Lenli direct animation kind of film using that if you're so inclined. Any questions about that material? All right. Any questions about next week and show and tell?
You said that you're gonna have slides like usual, right? Where you kind of put your name in and then you populate it.
Yeah, I'll set up slides for people. So if people do want to do slides, what I'll do is I'll just create a Google Slides deck, and then people can drop in slides. So what I'll do is I'll do that tomorrow. I'll set up those slides, so if people want access to it and start to dropping in their notes, they can do that. Cool. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I will see everyone next week for show and tell, and I hope you had a lot of fun. So I'll create a survey for next week, so you can give me feedback on the class. I'll mention that before class starts, but I really appreciate feedback if there's anything that you thought could have been improved in class, spending more time on a certain topic or something. We'll do more of that. So I'll drop that in both a Slack channel, and then I'll also mention it next week. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed learning lots of random stuff around films and watching some films, and then we'll have a little bit of a class closeout next week as well before we start show and tell. But hopefully you learned stuff, and hopefully next week, I think next week will be a lot of fun. And again, like please don't think you need to have like the world's best animated video or whatever for next week. It's like really just like show what you worked on, show what you were interested in, maybe talk about things you want to explore more in future, time off or whatever. And I'm here to give feedback. Other people are here to give feedback, and it should just be like a cool, like sort of close out to the class. All right, cool. I will see you next week then.
Thank
All right,
you.
bye everybody.